Let's go way in the back. Yeah, you.
Yeah, so I very much enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
Getting at the data seems good and the presentation reasonable.
Okay.
Reasonable conclusions.
Oh, I thought maybe you were giving me like a C+ on presentation. You did okay.
And you had front row seats to much of what's going on in Washington, from fireplaces to hiring techniques. And so I wanted to ask you about those because there's always been a revolving door between the federal government and the private firms that they've been designed to regulate. And I'm curious what your argument is for why the revolving door does not threaten the integrity and perhaps the very ability of these departments to fulfill the duties to regulate industry and the duties of the American people.
Well, actually, you know what? I'm going to give you a surprising answer, which is I think if you come from an entity that is regulated by the agency that you're going to, or you come from an agency that regulated the entity you're going to, I get a little bit nervous. I'll just kind of put the elephant on the table and talk about my personal experience, which is I didn't do anything with regard to financial services reform. I had no regulatory responsibility for that. You know, the Atlantic Monthly and others somehow just assume that I did, but if you actually look at the facts, I don't, and I have nothing to do with the federal government today. And by the way, it would be illegal for me to. So the way that the media sometimes presents things is also misleading. And I'd also point out, I think that there is a big loss to society from the kinds of narrow perspectives that would come from people who could only go into government when they did the kinds of things that I did before. I will tell you, I'm just going to be totally blunt, I think I've learned more about how the US economy works in the last 2 years dealing with actual companies than I did in 7 years at Brookings. The problem with being at a think tank, and of course the Brookings is the kind of polite society, I mean, there's nothing against Brookings. Brookings is a fabulous place. But the range of views and perspectives is pretty narrow. And I actually don't think we're doing ourselves any favors by having that kind of very narrow perspective, which is all that can get through a very tight system where you don't allow anyone who has any potential conflicts to enter government service. And I'd say at this point, I think actually, I'll actually go larger than that. I am really worried looking around at my friends and their reluctance to enter public service that we have tightened that it's such a sort of whack-a-mole through the confirmation process. And if you had a $75 problem on your tax return 10 years ago, your entire family is thrown through the gutter of front page stories and what have you. And the fact of the matter is pretty much, I mean, with all due respect, pretty much everyone has something. So it's all about how hard the committee wants to push, because the fact of the matter is pretty much everyone does. So it's a completely stochastic process. The best example of that, by the way, Lael Brainerd, the Undersecretary of Treasury for International Finance, is married to Kurt Campbell, who was the Assistant Secretary of something for the State Department. They're married. They file joint tax returns. Kurt Campbell and Lael both had to sign their tax returns. Kurt gets confirmed like in a few weeks because the Foreign Relations Committee doesn't scrutinize the tax returns the same way the Finance Committee does. Lael gets held up for, I forgot what it was, but something like 9 months based on the same tax returns that the Foreign Relations Committee had already approved. Same thing actually even with Jack Lew. Look at the difference in what he experienced being confirmed as Treasury Secretary, because that's a different committee than the State Department or OMB. And I think the bottom line is everyone's got something that if a committee wants to make a big deal out of, they can. Or another way of putting it is, I really wouldn't want you in a position of senior leadership if you have been so cautious that you have never, ever made any mistake ever over the past 20 years. And I'm wondering, actually, at some point whether we're going to, it's interesting to see some of the students. I suspect that this is going to get worse and then it will get better. It will get worse as more and more technology makes it easier and easier to find those flaws. And then at some point, people are going to say, you know what, I don't really care if you smoked marijuana when you were 21 or whatever it is. We all have the embarrassing, at that point, 20 years from now, everyone will have that embarrassing Facebook photo or whatever. And so the social norm will change, and the political system will reflect that. And I think that would actually be a very good thing to happen, but we're not there yet. And so I think the problem is broader than just potential conflicts of interest. I think we are at significant risk of having much lower quality of senior public servants than we should have, because people are shying away from entering government service. If I look, another way of putting it is, if I look around at people my age and ask the question 15 or 20 years ago, what kinds of economists were serving in government who could then become senior policymakers? Alan Blinder, Larry Summers. I mean, Laura Tyson, there were tons of economists serving in government. When I look around at my cohort, there are many, many fewer. When those folks were in their early to mid 40s, which is where I am now, you could count 20 people who could easily become senior policymakers. When I look around at my colleagues, based on what their interests are and sort of where they've been spending their time, it's more like 5 or maybe 10. And that problem won't manifest itself for 10 or 15 years, but then it will.